Items related to your assessment. The term paper. The term paper, it counts 20% of your grade. Let me talk a bit about what is required. First of all, it's due on Friday, the 23rd of April. Okay, 23rd of April. Now that's the end of the review week. That would be just before you have the exams. That review week, that it'll be due at that time. So you've got you've got a month basically to work on it. So let me just go through what I'm asking you to do. I want you to select an example. This is your choice. What you would be considering to be verbal art in English, okay? Not in other languages. Select an example of what is generally regarded as verbal art. Now, by verbal art, that can of course mean a poem. It could be, as we have ourselves looked at, a movie script. It could be the extract from a novel, certainly not the whole novel, but a part of it. It could be a speech, a song. I mean, it is very flexible in this regard, except that it must be an example of verbal art. But notice I say that what is generally regarded as verbal art. So it's not just your sort of your taste that is involved. It is something. Would have to be something that there would be more or less a popular opinion that this is indeed verbal art. Now, some questions that you will need to cover in addressing this. So you have a choice. You're choosing something that would generally be regarded as verbal art. There is a flexibility about the nature of what that is. But first of all, you need to answer this question. How is it an example of an extended metaphor involving symbolic articulation? Now for that, you're going to have to dig into look at where is it in the language that you discover the basis for the art in verbal art. Verbal art means it's language, right? So how is that being achieved? Where is the craft? Where is the art? So how is it an example of an extended metaphor? Drawing on the resources of language to create a pattern, to create an automatization, as we've discussed before, and then breaking that pattern, foregrounding. So now this would be, it can be your own analysis to discover this. You can also be taking that, because it will be something that is generally regarded as verbal art. There may be work that's been written about this piece of verbal art that would address this question as well. So this is something that you should find and discuss then in terms of how is it an example of an extended. Remember, Ruqayya Hassan said that what is an example of verbal art? It is a literary artifact that is an extended metaphor. We've discussed before what that means to say that something is an extended metaphor. So you're not looking at for example, this isn't about the language of science and grammatical metaphor and so forth. This will really be in terms of what would be considered truly verbal art. Now, as we'll see in a moment, when we look at Halliday's analysis of Darwin's Origin of Species, that in fact that treatise, although it is indeed science, the language of science, it also could very well be considered a kind of verbal art. Second question, how does language and metaphor contribute to the reader's, listener's, positive evaluation of your selected example? All right, so you've been looking at language and metaphor in the first question. Now, how does this contribute to the positive evaluation that you've identified? Now, that means, yes, you will need to cite sources to support your claim that readers, listeners value your selected example as indeed verbal art. Now, in this sense, is it how you do need to find out, you do need to read up, you do need to choose a text that you can indeed find sources that will support your claim that it is indeed an example of verbal art. It can be we will today be looking at some commencement speeches. Now, those could be very well considered verbal art. And as I've mentioned in the case of Darwin's Origin of Species, it is invention, but it is at the same time also really a kind of verbal art. But what distinguishes verbal art? It will be this use of language, this use of metaphor, this creating an extended metaphor through language. So be thinking about this now, and if you have questions about the nature of the text that you've chosen, feel free to get in touch with me and we can discuss it. But some things you do need to keep in mind. First of all, you will need to find other sources that have looked at that same text, that have looked at that same example of verbal art, and have discussed it, and obviously have shown the fact that it is indeed highly valued. All right, so how is your choice an example of extended metaphor involving symbolic articulation? Second, how does language and metaphor contribute to the reader's, the listener's positive evaluation of your selected example? What makes it art? Why do people perceive it as art? And why is it valued as art? This is then basically what I'm asking. It says verbal related to language. Okay, and there's a question on chat. Is it, does the question mean vocal? Not spoken. It doesn't have to be spoken. It can be written. Verbal in the sense of it is language related. Okay, good question. Thank you for asking it so that can be clarified. But we have been using this phrase verbal art, verbal science throughout. So I think that it should be clear that it is related to language. All right, so now please, I would suggest to you that you, first of all, start thinking about what it is you'd like to. I'm asking you to choose something that it's your choice, so that it should be something that you've also, at least to begin with, yourself consider to be art. Okay? Second thing about the continuous participation task, remember please, it is due on the 26th, all right? And it again goes back to a question that we have been discussing last week within the context of looking at language in the courtroom. Do you agree that sometimes the way we use language defeats its intended purpose? And certainly when we go back to look at that instance of taking place in the court where at the end of it, the judge reads a summation of the evidence and it goes on for more than one day and for several hours. The fact that it is written and then being read aloud, does it defeat its purpose, which is to give a summary to the jurors, to wind up and to let people know what actually took place? It isn't a summary that someone will come back later to read. It is something that's going to be read out to them, spoken, but written. So you may think of another example of a way in which the use of language defeats its intended purpose. You don't have to use the example that I have been referring to. You can, if you have an idea of something else, please, by all means, write about that. Okay, so this will be the third continuous participation task. You have one more, and that will be given out next week. That'll be the last one, and that will be due on the 9th of April. All right, so that will be the last one that we'll be looking at. And we're already in week 10, so it's winding to a close, and so do be thinking about your term paper. All right, and it will definitely require you, I want to emphasize this point, that it is going to be something that you will need to identify other sources that back up your claim that indeed this is something valued positively as an example of verbal art. Okay, so let's take a look at this then. And I've been wanting to get to this for a while, but it always seems we run out of time and not get to this particular topic, and that is looking at Darwin's Origin of Species. I'm sure you're all familiar with that work. I mean, it has certainly introduced into science the idea of evolution, and it has certainly changed people's thinking. Now, how has this, what is there about this particular text? It is inventive, all right? But yet at the same time, what gives it that sort of, what allows it to become positively evaluated? I'd like you to take a look on the screen. I'm going to be reading, and I'm going to be looking at what's on page here. It's from this text Halliday wrote about, Halliday did this analysis of what the final two paragraphs. It's not the whole Origin of Species, it's the final two paragraphs. And he looked at it as an example of a highly valued text. Now, let me read what's in that box on the left side of your screen. I do not know how long it took Darwin to compose these two paragraphs, or whether he reflected consciously on their construction as he was doing it. I imagine not. I certainly had no idea, this is Halliday speaking, of course, when starting the analysis of what I was going to find. I had the sense of a remarkable, powerful piece of writing as the climax to a remarkable and powerful book. And it struck me that something of the effect of these two paragraphs might lie in the patterning of the theme and of the new. That is, in the textual component within the grammar of the clause. You remember what theme is, right? The beginning. How we begin each clause, and new information, usually what comes toward the end. So what he's saying is that when he looks at this, he's noticing that there seems to be a patterning here in terms of how Darwin, in writing it, began the clauses that make up the text, and also the progression of ideas that come through as new information. Continuing, it is important to stress that is in fact all that I have been looking at in this paper. He's just been focusing on theme and new. I've said almost nothing about cohesion or transitivity. What's transitivity? Remember the choice of process type and who are the participants? Or mood. Mood. Remember, we've referred to that as whether it is making a statement or asking a question, or the imperative. Or the clause complex, whether you have parataxis or hypotaxis. Or any of the other lexicogrammatical systems, processes that go into the makeup of a text. Some, at least, of these other features would undoubtedly show interesting and significant patterns if we were to analyze them with this or some comparable kind of functional grammatics. It is pointless to try and classify a text such as this, to ask whether it is a scientific treatise, or a declaration of faith, or an entertaining work of literature. It is a product of the impact between an intellectual giant and a moment in the space-time continuum of our culture, with all the complexity of meaning that implies. With this very partial analysis, a fragment of the grammar of a fragment of the text, I've tried to suggest something of how this text takes its place in SEMO history, the history of how meaning is made. So, obviously, highly valued. Obviously, well, I mean, from Halliday is seeing it as something which obviously stands out, right? Now, how does he approach it? How have we been looking at these texts? How have we been looking at language? We've been doing it in much the same way as Halliday does. And again, what I'm going to be reading here is from the other side of the page, where Halliday writes this: what is important is that we should be able to use the same theory and method of linguistic analysis, the same grammatics. Remember, you have linguistics, but Halliday's saying grammatics. It is the means, the wording that realizes the meaning. What is important is that we should be able to use the same theory and method of linguistic analysis, the same grammatics, whatever kind of text or subtext we are trying to interpret, whether it's Tennyson, Darwin, Mother Goose, or the Scientific American. Is it popular science? Is it considered a great work, a scientific treatise? Is it a child's text? What is the nature of the text? How can we be able to look at the text? We need to have Halliday saying a way to approach it, and that I hope you've been seeing over the last 9 weeks leading up to this point, where what we've been doing is we've been looking at not only the fact that, yes, here may be a great speech, or here may be an example where language is being used in a way that defeats its purpose. Can we explain why? Can we explain the value in the text? How do we do so? We need to look at the wording that realizes the meaning, and this encompasses the choices that we've just been talking about in terms of theme, or what occurs at the beginning of a clause, or the choice of process, or who is doing what in the text. How is the text structured? How are the how are the ideas expanded on one another. Now, if we don't have that means available to us, if we don't have that way of being able to look at a text, if we simply approach, as Halliday is saying, each text with an ad hoc, do-it-yourself kit of private commentary, and I sure hope you don't see the way we've been looking at text as that. It isn't just, well, I like this text and this is something I've noticed about it. No, we want to get away from that sort of ad hoc, anyhow, do-it-yourself, sort of private commentary about why we like that text. And that's what I don't want to see in your essay. I don't want to see this, sort of, make sure it isn't an ad hoc sort of do-it-yourself private commentary about why you think that text is highly valued, as why is it art. If we approach a text like that, we have no way of explaining how texts are similar or different. We have no way to look at the aesthetic, the beauty, the functional values, how it meets its purpose, that differentiate one text from another or one voice from another within the frontiers of the same text. All right, so let's take a look at this text here. One point that Halliday has made already, and that is that he is looking at this text from the standpoint of theme and new. What's theme? Remember, theme is how each clause begins. It may be the grammatical subject at the beginning. It may be the prepositional phrase at the beginning. Halliday is noticing in this table, what you see on the screen here, he's sort of summarizing the motifs, the ideas that reoccur in theme position in each clause, as that he's looking at just those two closing paragraphs, all right, of the text. So in this subtext, he is looking at just one aspect, and that is the choice of theme, how each clause begins. And he's noticing a progression of ideas, motifs, he calls them. And he breaks it down into sort of three parts: authorities, the phenomena of species, which again breaks down into inhabitants and groups, life form and endowments, variation, and finally, the sources, law, war of nature. So these motifs he sees as reoccurring as theme as we read those last final two paragraphs. Now, he sort of maps it out. You can see on the left-hand side. We'll take a look at it. I hope can make it a bit clearer. Let's just take a segment of what he was referring to. It begins with authors of the highest eminence. So he begins with what? Authors of the highest eminence. Like a science treatise, in the sense that very often a piece of verbal science, we'll call it that, begins with referring to what others have done. Building on, we're supposed to be building on knowledge, so we begin with other authorities, what others have said, before getting on to what we are going to offer in terms of our contribution to science, right? So it begins like that as well here, authors of the highest eminence. And then it moves on to my mind. So it's becoming more personal. Later on at the end of sentence 3, it seemed to me, I'm highlighting here not just what's themed, because I'm noticing something, and Halliday makes this point, that we seem to be progressing as we go through this, because it is going from authorities of the highest eminence. Notice the modality, seem to be. It's hedging a bit. You know what I mean by hedging? It's not right coming out, authors of the highest eminence are fully satisfied. No, it seemed to be. It's a perception. There's a hesitancy here. And that comes through in the choices of modality. Later on, as I say, toward the end of sentence 3, which, again, sentence 2, to my mind. Sentence 3, I. So it's gone to first person. At the end of sentence 3, seem to me. Again, we still have that sort of hesitancy, that hedging. It seems. Sentence 4, judging from the past. And so we've gone from others, and it goes on to talk about the creator and the past, judging from the past. But I want you to notice something changes in 4. What happens? Judging from the past, we. Notice the shift from first person, I, to my mind. It shifts to we. It becomes first person plural. And you notice that repeated in 4, in 6, in 7, in 8. We. It's not just his personal view, Darwin's personal view. It's our view. Still, there's a hedging. We may safely infer. 6, we can. Still, there's that modality that's suggesting a hesitancy. We may feel certain. 8, we may look with some confidence. Do you notice that it's interesting because we go from inferring to foretelling in 6, to certainty in 7b, confidence in 8. Notice that progression, that what Darwin is doing is it's gone from, yeah, you had authorities in the past say this, I, first person, but then it shifts to we, and we go from inferring to predicting to certainty to confidence. Yeah, it's still got that modality there, may, but that is typical of science too, okay? But notice that it's gaining a particular sort of confidence in what's coming as far as the conclusion. Okay, then it shifts to getting into sort of the content of what he's talking about in terms of evolution. And we have the production, extinction of the past and present inhabitants of the world. And you can see how I've highlighted it in green, these sort of topics related to species, life forms, differentiation. That is repeated in what follows. And we have, it can be sort of then further categorized into inhabitants, species, and groups, living, forms of life, birds. It goes on into the next page here to sentence 10, birds, various insects, and back to sort of the idea of production, extinction of the past and present inhabitants of the world, succession, no cataclysm, natural selection. All right, so yes, we see these ideas, and Halliday has sort of grouped them and categorized them as we've just noticed. Finally, the last sort of category of theme was referring to sources, these laws from the war of nature, this planet, and so on. All right, now, by this time, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, okay, so he's listed out everything that occurs at the beginning of each clause. And yeah, they are sort of topics. They do have sort of an organization in terms of how they're put together. But is that so outstanding? And yes, we can make certain comments about it. Not done yet. Not done yet. New information. A similar thing that Halliday did with theme, he now does with new. And what is new? Remember, that's what occurs toward the end of the clause. Theme is what? Theme is occurring at the beginning, and it's usually ideas that are established, they are old information, they're given information. The new information is what comes more toward the end of each clause. And again, he's done the same thing. The same last two paragraphs, going through, looking at explanation in terms of creation versus evolution. Looking at the idea of transmission and how it breaks down into, again, three sort of subcategories here. And finally, a third and final sort of motif that's, again, new information, and in this, again, related to the laws and so forth, as what he's been mentioning before. Now, again, okay, so you have, Darwin has sort of got a progression of ideas in terms of what comes through at the beginning of each clause, and there is sort of progression of ideas that come toward the end. So what? Now, this is Halliday's point. These motifs, these ideas that have been occurring throughout the text, that have created certain threads. Okay, I want you to think of it like that. Certain, or tracks through the text. A progression of ideas. These motifs culminate. This is Halliday commenting about it. He says, these motifs culminate in a resounding lexico-grammatical cadence. And this is, Halliday says, brings the clause, the sentence, the paragraph, the chapter, and the book to a crashing conclusion with a momentum to which I can think of no parallel elsewhere in literature. What he's saying is that those ideas that have sort of been, you can identify certain threads and certain tracks of ideas that proceed through the text, occurring at the beginning and at the ending. But the whole point of it is that they all now come together. They culminate in that concluding final sentence. There is grandeur in this view of life with its several powers, having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one. And that's whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved. This is the last sentence. What Halliday is saying is that, and you can see the table at the bottom, that's where we started, that those threads or tracks, however you want to think metaphorically about it, the ideas, authorities, the phenomena of species, sources that we see in terms of what occurs at the beginning of each clause, the ideas, and then what occurs as the main point or the new information at the end of each of these clauses. These ideas now, notice how they all end up coming here and are all reappearing here in this last sentence. He brings all these threads to a final, concluding sentence. Grandeur. And you'll notice at the bottom, I'll highlight where it comes in terms of whether theme or new. Ennoblement. There's grandeur in this view of life with its several powers, life forms, endowments, from theme. Having been originally breathed, transmission, into a few forms or into one, inhabitants, groups. And whilst this planet has gone cycling on, again referring to time past into the future, according to the fixed law of gravity, the law, the sources, gravity. From so simple a beginning, again the sources, endless forms, most beautiful, the variation, and most wonderful have been and are being evolved. In other words, he brings it all there. All of it ties up together. All the ideas that have been gradually building throughout the text come to exist and come to rest here in this final sentence. So that, as Halliday said, and let me go back to that, these motifs culminate in a resounding lexicogrammatical cadence that brings the clause, the sentence, the paragraph, the chapter, the book to a crashing conclusion with a momentum to which I can think of no parallel elsewhere in literature. It's science. And Halliday is saying, is this science? Or is this a statement of faith, what he believes? Or is it art? What we can see is that there is a design to it. The ideas have gradually been brought together to bring this whole treatise, Origin of Species, these paragraphs, these sentences, these clauses to a crashing conclusion. Because what has been done is to culminate, to bring together all the ideas that have been there, which have been sort of been there in summary and brought there to that final conclusion. There is grandeur in this view of life with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and as whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. It is a beautiful sentence. You can have whatever is your view on the science, on the belief, but you have to admit it's art. What we've been looking at, and what I want you to be sort of noticing, is that there is a difference between speaking and writing. I've made that point, especially last time when we spoke about the language in the courtroom. It's something that people aren't very much aware of. They think language is language and speaking is speaking. And the way you write, people don't realize that the way you write is really quite different than the way you speak. What's the difference between spoken and written language? And I'm going to be quoting here from a text. It's called The Essential Hallidays. It's something that I edited. It's because I'm the editor for his collected works, which are 11 volumes. And because there are a number of key concepts in Halliday's systemo-functional linguistics, I asked him and I worked with him to identify what those key concepts would be. And then I went through the collected works and extracted out anything that would be referring to one of these key concepts, and that's what ends up in the essential Halliday. From this, then, is this discussion on spoken versus written language. Now, Halliday says this: writing puts language in chains. It freezes it so that it becomes a thing to be reflected on. Hence, it changes the ways that language is used for meaning with. It becomes a thing to be reflected on, to be thought about, to be considered. On the one hand, when he says it puts language in chains, it freezes it, it doesn't sound very good, right? But it's necessary. It does bind it, it does freeze it, it does restrict, because it's there, it's written. But then it's something that, because it is there, you can look at it, read it, reflect on it. Halliday continues, he says, writing deprives language of the power to intuit, to make indefinitely many connections in different directions at once, to explore, by tolerating them, contradictions, to represent experiences fluid and indeterminate. Yes, writing does sort of restrict, sort of further expression of something. I mean, once it's written, it's sort of there, as we've said. But it's also the way we think. When you are writing, the way you think and process it and put it down into words is different than if you're just speaking, right? And so, in fact, what Halliday's suggesting at the close here on at the end, it says, it is therefore destructive of one fundamental human potential, to think on your toes. The idea for spontaneity in thinking, it is this ability to intuit, to be creating, to be fluid, to be imprecise. I mean, to think on your, I wouldn't say think on your toes. My expression is to think on your feet. And when we are sort of like we go through school, and the way we are being taught and the way we function is basically to be expressing our ideas in writing, and less so in terms of being able to just sort of talk and to think and to be able to deal with. So really, our thought processes, Halliday's suggesting, may be affected. But because so far, the way Halliday's been writing, it would seem like he's been putting writing down, right? He's using words like deprives, destructive, chains, freezing. It sounds quite, as I said at the beginning, quite negative, right? But writing creates another potential. Yes, on the one hand, the ability to reflect, but also the ability to structure our thoughts, to categorize our thoughts, to disciplinize. It creates, he says, a new kind of knowledge. Scientific knowledge, a new way of learning, education. It's needed, it's necessary. Yeah, it may affect the way we are able to think on our feet, true enough. But at the same time, it is serving another purpose. But you have to be thinking about the medium, spoken or written, and the purpose to which you're wanting to put it. And if your purpose is to expand on a new way of learning, to expand scientific knowledge, to educate, to structure, to categorize, to disciplinize. If this is your purpose, then writing serves your purpose, because it gives you the ability to think about it, to reflect on it. Halliday writes this. He says, writing changed the social semiotic. It changed the way we make meaning. And he says it does so on two levels. Superficially, created documentation. Our experience is filed. We have files of our experience that we can look things up. It is writing is a development in our technology. It gives a new ability to what we can do with language. It's another way of being able to put our ideas across, but in doing so, we give them a certain, they are fixed. At the same time, this idea that it's sort of fixed, that it's sort of rigid, it's not surprising that the world of written language is a nominalized world, a world of things with a high lexical density, packed grammatical metaphors. It is these features that enable discourse to become technical. It is within the nature of the way we write that in doing so, we also turn our world into a world of things. We turn it into nouns. And we then pack so much information into those nouns. So in this example, such an exercise had the potential for intrusions by the government into the legitimate privacy of non-government schools. And this is a sentence, all right? I haven't punctuated it like that, but it obviously is a sentence, and it clearly has a verb, had, a relational process we've referred to. The verb to be, the verb to have, they express relations between things, groups of words that form an idea, a thing, such an exercise. But then notice the other side of the verb to be, that group of words, we'll call it a nominal group, a noun group. The potential for intrusions by the government into the legitimate privacy of non-government schools. Notice the layers here, the layers of on the one hand, embedding of ideas. In a way, I prefer to refer to it as layering. It's not really embedding in a grammatical sense. But we have the potential for intrusions by the government into the legitimate privacy of non-government schools. And at the same time, we also see grammatical metaphor. Instead of using the verb to be able to, we say the potential. Instead of saying to intrude, intrusions. Instead of private, the adjective, privacy. We turn the verbs and the adjectives into nouns. Layers, grammatical metaphor, creates a lexical density, meaning there are so many words, content words, packed into this one group. So that what Halliday says is this: writing, speaking constitute different ways of knowing, such that any theory of knowledge and of learning must encompass both. You need both. Our understanding of the social and the natural order depends on both, and on the complementarity between the two as interpretations of experience. They are complementary. The point is that in education, we emphasize writing, but at the same time, we should emphasize also speaking. Also, this ability to intuit, to think on your feet, think on your toes, as Halliday puts it. It should be part of the way part of the education. Because what you need is both. You need to be able to master both. Written technical discourse, in particular, is characterized by rather simple clause and sentence structure. Each sentence, one clause, that clause consisting of just one or two nominal groups, one of them perhaps governed by a preposition, propped up by a verbal group, usually of relational process, and most typically the verb be. The nominal groups, on the other hand, may be enormously long and complex, since all the lexical material is compressed into these one or two groups. And that is exactly what we see here. Exactly. Simple clause. Highly lexically dense nominal groups. Both of which, there are two, related by a process, a verb, a relational process. Not the verb to be here, but the verb to have. This is the language of science. Spontaneous, though, spoken language. The clause complex becomes extraordinarily long and intricate, meaning you keep extending the clauses. It becomes more clausally complex. If we analyze one of these in terms of its hypotactic, paratactic nexuses, we get a sense of its complexity. It's very seldom we find anything like these in writing. It's a different kind of complexity. That's why Halliday uses the word intricacy, clausal intricacy for speaking, lexical density for writing. He continues, what one can say is that the more intricate a given clause complex is, the more likely it is that it happened in speech rather than in writing. But be careful of the assumption that because we see a grammar in written language and talk about the use of grammar in written language, it is not as though spoken is without a grammar, without an organization. Yes, I don't mean the grammar of the English language. What I mean is grammar in the sense as we've talked about it throughout the semester, the use of what kind of process, how the clauses are connected, parataxis or hypotaxis, how what's theme, what's new information, all these things. Now, there is as much an organization in spoken as there is in written. But Halliday's point is it is an organization of a different kind. Written language, he says, gains power by its density. Spoken language gains power by its intricacy. We are up to almost 5 to the hour. Sorry, I've gone a bit over before having a break. So we'll take a break now, and we'll come back at 5 past the hour. Okay, let's take a break here. Okay, let's continue, and to do so, let's take a look at what you see on your screen here. Is this spoken or is this written? Although the term postmodern had been in cultural circulation since the 1870s, It is only in the 1960s that we see the beginnings of what is now understood as postmodernism. In the work of Susan Sontag and Leslie Fiedler, we encounter the celebration of what Sontag calls a new sensibility, a new pluralism, following the supposed collapse of the distinction between high and popular culture. It is a sensibility in revolt against the normalizing function of modernism. Its rebellion is an attack on the canonization of modernism's rebellion, an attack on modernism's official status as the high culture of the modern capitalist world. What these critics oppose is not so much the project of modernism as its canonization in the museum and the academy. Obviously, it is written. Why can we say so? What is there that identifies it as such? Well, if we take a look at the text itself, you'll notice that there's no reference to the writer. There's no, it isn't like who authored it, all right? It is more or less a statement of views. It is supposedly an objective statement that doesn't incorporate the subjectivity of a particular author or writer. So no references to the writer. We notice a frequent use of embedding. So we have what is now understood as postmodernism, the object of a preposition. Again, the celebration of what Sontag calls a new sensibility. Again, object of a preposition. And a third example, what these critics oppose as the grammatical subject. And so it's a kind of nominalization, not turning verbs into nouns, but turning clauses into nouns. Very lexically dense noun phrase structures. Mainly this is due to the heavy post-modification. A sensibility in revolt against the normalizing function of modernism. What's the head noun here? A sensibility. And then post-modified with in revolt against the normalizing function of modernism. An attack on the canonization of modernism's rebellion. An attack on modernism's official status as the high culture of the modern capitalist world. Lexically dense. Lexically dense, meaning you have a lot of content words per clause because you've packed so much information into the participants, into the noun groups, the noun phrases that make up the clause. Besides that, you have a lot of vocabulary that has been nominalized. Verbs that have been turned into nouns, circulation, beginnings, celebration, the collapse, and on it goes. The verbs are turned into nouns, and we notice a lot of these, what we would call nominalized vocabulary. Now, those three features, frequent use of embedding, turning clauses into nouns, basically. Lexically dense noun phrases where you take a lot of information and pack it in, either as prepositional phrases or relative clauses, and a lot of nominalized vocabulary. Throughout, the emphasis is on, as you'll notice, repackaging the way we see the world in terms of nouns, nominalization. That is what we find in the language of writing. It is clausally, it is simple. lexically dense. Now, that's exactly what we noticed when we came to looking at the way in which the judge was writing his summary of the evidence. We noticed, again, a lot of linguistic features that cause comprehension problems if, in fact, it's someone that has to listen to this and not be able to read it. It wouldn't, it's, of course, if we even if we took that text here and looked at it and said, is it easy to comprehend? No, it's not. We need time to sort of look at it, digest it, because there's so much information packed into there. Likewise, to just have something that is written, just be listened to not have the chance to see it, to be able to figure it out. That is the nature. When written language requires one's ability to be able to reflect on it. There is a disconnect, as we noticed, because the technology is such that we are turning it into something that is written. It has all the features of writing, the way we write. But therefore, then it's not something that we can easily listen to and understand. Lexical density. Remember, I illustrated this also from last week. One of the judge's sentences, we have 15 content words. Lexical density. All right, now, I've played this for you before. This is, you remember Nixon when he resigned. Today I'm going to be taking a look at 3 of his speeches, all revolving around his resignation, to look at the differences between them. The first, I'm going to work our way back, all right? We're going to start with when he left the White House. And then the next one we're going to look at is the night before, when he actually resigned. And then we'll look at the speech that he gave when he became president for that second term. In the midst of all the Watergate scandal that was going on, the election took place and he was elected by a landslide. And then he gave his second inaugural, followed not long after by his resignation and then by his departure speech. Remember what distinguished the departure speech?
Sorry, sir, you're not playing anything. I believe the screen is frozen.
Oh, shoot. Is the screen frozen? How? Thank you very much for letting me know. So you have not seen, let me back up a bit.
It was like one of her own.
Thank you very much for letting me know. Now, what did you see so far? Can I just ask?
Ever since you said you're going to play the speech, there's the screen frozen.
So
right from the very beginning.
From here. All right. Thank you very much for letting me know. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
All right. So let me, if you don't mind, everyone, since it hasn't come through, let me play it.
Something else I'd like for you to tell your young people. You know, people often come in and say, what'll I tell my kids? You know?
Can everyone see it now, all right?
Government.
Yes, it's playing.
Okay, thank you.
They see the mistakes that are made. They get the impression that everybody is here for the purpose of feathering his nest. That's why I made this earlier point. Not in this administration. Not one single man or woman. And I say to them, there are many fine careers. This country needs good farmers, good businessmen, good plumbers, good carpenters. I remember my old man. I think that they would have called him sort of a little man, common man. He didn't consider himself that way. You know what he was? He was a streetcar motorman first, and then he was a farmer, and then he had a lemon ranch. It was the poorest lemon ranch in California, I can assure you. He sold it before they found oil on it. And then he was a grocer. But he was a great man. Because he did his job. And every job counts, up to the hilt, regardless of what happened. Nobody will ever write a book, probably, about my mother. Well, I guess all of you would say this about your mother. My mother was a saint. And I think of her, 2 boys dying of tuberculosis, nursing 4 others in order that she could take care of my older brother for 3 years in Arizona, and seeing each of them die, and when they died, it was like one of her own. Yes, she will have no books written about her. But she was a saint. Now, however, we look to the future.
All right. Now, I play this because I want to make the point. This is clearly spoken. This is clearly not written. It has not been drafted out. He's speaking as he's thinking. This is spoken language. Not read to be spoken, but spoken. Now, the difference between this and what we've been looking at here in terms of the judge's summation of evidence, or this example of academic writing, cannot be more obvious. What we've seen here in the academic writing is this lexically dense, highly nominalized kind of language. It is something that you need to be able to then read in order to really be able to process it, because it has so much. I mean, when we say it's lexically dense, we're talking about an information load that is much greater than what you see in a spoken language like this. Now, I want to compare 3 speeches that were given by Richard Nixon. We've just looked at the departure speech. I'm going to be working my way back, all right? And we're going to take a look next at his resignation speech. But do you notice the difference that we see between the nature of the connections between the clauses? The spoken, the language that is being used, just thinking on one's feet, that spontaneous way of speaking, highly paratactic, and you see it in all of the and. We're just linking ideas. We're extending the what we're saying, and conjunctions help us serve that purpose. Now, notice that the resignation speech is almost the same as his second inaugural speech. We're going to be looking at hypotaxis and parataxis. I put this on the screen to remind you what it is we're talking about. Those connections between clauses. Parataxis, it's clauses that are of equal grammatical rank You've said it is symmetrical. It is simply adding on ideas one after the other, whereas hypotaxis requires some sort of consideration for one idea, which is the main idea, and another which is sort of related to it, but peripheral to it, supporting to it. It's not surprising that hypotaxis is more frequent in the language of writing, where we have had a chance to think about and consider how we are going to present the ideas and how an idea can be related to another one which is more supporting. So let's take a look at the resignation speech. But I want to sort of put this whole series of speeches within a historical context. So let's get some idea of what this whole scandal was. What was going on? Why did Nixon leave? Why did he resign? When he resigned, he asked his speechwriter, as explained here, his speechwriter was Ray Price, to work on a statement. And when he made this speech, it was in front of cameras, it was on television. Well, the other departure speech was as well, but this was him actually sitting there reading out his resignation. What he asked for was not a breastfeeding mea culpa. He did not want to say he was sorry. He didn't feel sorry. He did not want to proclaim guilt. He didn't feel he was guilty. But he did ask his speechwriter to help produce for him a healing speech. Now, how is this going to be healing? How can this speech help rally the country to his successor? Let's take a look at something of what was going on at the time.
It was a political scandal that changed our country forever, beginning with the break-in at Democratic National Headquarters in the Watergate office complex, and ending in the resignation of President Richard Nixon. Tonight, on the eve of the 45th anniversary of the Watergate break-in, we take an in-depth look at the events that led to his downfall.
The president is going to address the nation and presumably announce his resignation in a half an hour from now.
People will be at television sets and radios tonight to hear what the president has to say.
This is the political crime story of the century.
In just a moment now, the President of the United States will begin his speech, perhaps his last speech from the White House.
He always saw enemies. He always saw people in the shadows. And his motto, I believe, was do unto others before they have a chance to do unto you.
That's enough.
There was an obsession with leaks. You don't blame the leaks when facts come out that are showing wrongdoing.
No, there will be no picture.
This is the funny thing. Had it not been for Watergate, I think this man could have gone down in history as one of the more significant presidents in the history of this country.
Out. You don't have to stay, do you?
We were witnessing the implosion of an American presidency.
The President has taken his place at the table in the White House where he's going to speak. Here now, the next picture will be the President of the United States. I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
It was the scandal that took down a president, a plot of lies, espionage, and secret dealings that shattered how the nation viewed the presidency and the truth. It all started here, the now infamous Watergate office building, when police were called to investigate a strange break-in.
I was a sergeant assigned to the people on the street, called us the bum squad.
What I looked like in 1972 was like a junior Charles Manson.
Georgetown, Friday night going into Saturday is always crazy back then.
On June 17, 1972, there was a break-in at the Democratic National Committee's headquarters in the Watergate office complex. This was the start of what would be the political crime of the century.
At the center of it all were two men, G. Gordon Liddy, an ex-FBI agent who had been hired by President Nixon's campaign to run covert operations. He recruited James McCord, the security chief of the committee to re-elect the president.
And the plan was to get negative information about the potential nominee of the Democratic Party. Well, how are you going to get the negative information? A lot of people would say breaking into the Democratic National Committee was way out, off the charts. Yes, but not that far off.
McCord would go into the Watergate building and put in tapes in the door.
It was taped, so it would not lock.
The hero of that night was a man named Frank Wills. Frank Wills was the security guard at the Watergate office building.
You found the door taped once, and you took the tape off. And then you found it taped a second time.
It was something that told me that you should check, not only check the door, but that you call the police.
About 1:52 in the morning, the call comes out for an alleged burglary at the Watergate Hotel. I just kind of blinked my eyes. Yeah, we'll take the call. I had on a old funky golf cap. I think I had just like a T-shirt underneath, trying to give me the image I wasn't a police officer.
If a uniformed car had answered that call, it could have been a whole different ballgame.
There's a lookout, Alfred Baldwin, who's supposed to warn the burglars if there's trouble. The police unit that responds to the call, they're not dressed like police officers. So Baldwin doesn't even notice them.
Our adrenaline is pumped. We get to this room here. I kick the door open.
I pulled my revolver.
Baldwin was supposed to be the lookout across the street.
He was watching a show called Attack of the Puppet People. By the time Alfred Baldwin had notified them, it was too late, and they had to run and hide like rats. We're rolling down this hallway, checking the offices on both sides of the hallways, make sure that nobody's hiding from behind us. I was startled by an arm hitting next to the glass on the petition. It scared the living bejesus out of me. I screamed something to the effect, "Come out with your hands up or I'm gonna blow your head off." 10 hands went up, and they came out, and that's where the arrest occurred, right here. The 5 burglars that were arrested inside the DNC, McCord, Barker, Sturgis, Martinez, and Gonzalez. This was not your normal, typical burglary. There was bugging devices, tear gas pens, many, many rolls of film, locksmith tools, thousands of dollars in $100 bills consecutively ordered.
Who goes into the Democratic National Committee looking for money or looking for jewels? No, you go looking for political information. And who wants that? Why, your opponent, naturally.
People weren't saying, oh my God, this is clearly going to implicate Richard Nixon. It just seemed bizarre. It would take some enterprising young journalists to ferret out the importance of the story.
Woodward and Bernstein were assigned to this burglary just as a matter of routine.
Editors kind of said, we got this strange burglary.
They were young reporters trying to make their way up the ladder in the Washington Post.
When you talk about the people who made a difference when it came to Watergate, you talk about Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein.
They sent me to the courthouse where the 5 burglars caught in the Democratic headquarters were being arraigned. The judge asked the leader, James McCord, where did you work? And McCord went, CIA. It was stunning.
And they discovered that McCord was a security chief for the committee to re-elect the president. Well, okay, folks, this was a political break-in.
There was a notebook belonging to one of the burglars that had the name in it, H. Hunt W. House. And of course, it turned out to be Howard Hunt, who had worked for the CIA, who had been hired at the White House, really to undertake dirty tricks.
You knew that this smoke that was billowing up from the Oval Office, there had to be some fire there.
It's like the Dylan song, it don't take a weatherman to know which way the wind blows.
Presidential Press Secretary Ron Ziegler called it a third-rate burglary attempt and said it was nothing the president would ever be concerned with.
Richard Nixon is obstructing justice from the beginning. But what would be known as the smoking gun was when he approves a plan to use the CIA to blunt an FBI investigation into the money that the burglars had. It's clear in the conversation this is being done for political purposes, basically to save the skin of the White House, and the president says he approves it.
Woodward and Bernstein had scores of sources, but there was one source that was special. a guy really high up. He was known as Deep Throat.
We would learn years later that Deep Throat was Mark Felt, number 2 at the FBI.
He was in the perfect position to understand what was coming into the investigation, as well as what he could observe maybe from above the investigation.
I want to talk about Watergate.
We're not going to talk about that subject.
All the president's men created a sense of danger. They were constantly risking things by trying to find out the truth.
You can trust me, you know that.
The other thing the movie did was create that expression, follow the money.
Just follow the money.
And put it into American culture.
Deep Throat made it clear that the money was important, that there was a trail to follow. And Carl established that a $25,000 check had actually gone into the bank account of one of the Watergate burglars.
The $25,000 check linked contributions to President Nixon's re-election campaign to the slush fund used to pay the burglars who broke into the Watergate office complex.
I said, oh my God, this now establishes an undeniable connection between the committee for Nixon's re-election and the burglars.
John Mitchell was the Attorney General. He's a Nixon loyalist.
The highest law enforcement officer in America controlled a secret fund that paid for undercover activities against Nixon's political opponents. Bradley said they're about to call the Attorney General of the United States a crook. There's never been a story like this in our history. And we took a deep breath and said, yeah.
And ABC News has projected that Richard Nixon has in fact been re-elected to the presidency to a second term. So the question now, I suppose, is how big will Mr. Nixon win?
It was a giant landslide. There was virtually no reaction to the stories we did. And it was a way of saying, Watergate? Who cares?
And whatever happened to Watergate? I don't know. Apparently nothing. They've got a trial of the accused in that case, and that's going to be tried in due course, and I think that's probably the end of the story.
But it wasn't the end of the story. And what it ended up leading to was Nixon to resign. And that scandal, the Watergate scandal, what we're going to be looking at now is his resignation speech, the speech that he gave on the night before he departed. This was the public speech. This is the announcement. As was mentioned, this was the one everyone was paying attention to see, because at this point, when he came on the television, it wasn't clear what, in fact, he was going to say. It wasn't even clear whether for sure he was going to resign. And so everyone is sort of waiting to hear what it is that he's going to say after it was discovered the fact that he had approved actions that had been taken to try to stop the investigation into what actually happened. So let's take a look. This is this resignation speech, and I've done a word cloud. I usually like to do a word cloud of a speech just to give me a feel for what it is that was sort of prominent in terms of the concepts, the thoughts, the words. And of course, you can see people, president, office, nation, so on. Now, at the bottom, I've sort of tried to capture a mapping of the text itself, and you'll see that I've highlighted the fact that in paragraph 8, well, that's really where he finally resigned. Of course, that you can see that there's very much more that he goes on to say, all of which is feeding back to and referring back to what he has just concluded.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
All right, so that was the climax. All right, the climax came rather early on, already in paragraph 8. Now, just let's take a look then. What was leading up to that statement? And I'm looking at a word cloud of paragraphs 1 through 8. We notice a similarity with what's occurred throughout the whole text. President, office, Congress, nation. You don't see Congress much in the whole text, but here it figures very prominently. We notice some words that were very prominent in the whole text which don't occur that much within the first 8 paragraphs. Even America itself is not so prominent in those first 8 paragraphs leading up to his announcement of his resignation. Here's the first 8 paragraphs.
Good evening. This is the 37th time I have spoken to you from this office, where so many decisions have been made that shape the history of this nation. Each time I have done so to discuss with you some matter that I believe affected the national interest. In all the decisions I have made in my public life, I have always tried to do what was best for the nation. Throughout the long and difficult period of Watergate, I have felt it was my duty to persevere, to make every possible effort to complete the term of office to which you elected me. In the past few days, however, it has become evident to me that I no longer have a strong enough political base in the Congress to justify continuing that effort. As long as there was such a base, I felt strongly that it was necessary to see the constitutional process through to its conclusion, that to do otherwise would be unfaithful to the spirit of that deliberately difficult process and a dangerously destabilizing precedent for the future. But with the disappearance of that base, I now believe that the constitutional purpose has been served, and there is no longer a need for the process to be prolonged. I would have preferred to carry through to the finish, whatever the personal agony it would have involved. And my family unanimously urged me to do so. But the interests of the nation must always come before any personal considerations. From the discussions I have had with congressional and other leaders, I have concluded that because of the Watergate matter, I might not have the support of the Congress that I would consider necessary to back the very difficult decisions and carry out the duties of this office in the way the interests of the nation will require. I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first. America needs a full-time president and a full-time Congress, particularly at this time with problems we face at home and abroad. To continue to fight through the months ahead for my personal vindication would almost totally absorb the time and attention of both the President and the Congress in a period when our entire focus should be on the great issues of peace abroad and prosperity without inflation at home. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
All right, so in that, notice in that paragraph 8, I shall resign. But what were the kind of modal auxiliaries that were being used prior to that? We notice that there are quite a few would. What does would suggest? Would sort of suggests something which is sort of hypothetical. It's not, it hasn't actually happened, all right? Well, indeed, up until that paragraph 8, when we hear the shall resign, it all has been sort of not yet real. But you'll notice that after that paragraph 8, from there on, you begin to see a lot of will. The future. It shifts the attention away from sort of the hypothetical, and we see, yes, there is some must and may, but it very clearly from paragraph 8 onward becomes will. What about the future? What is it that he's talking about with respect to the future? Well, he's talking about what will follow after he has now resigned, who his successor will be, what will take place after this has happened, his resignation. And you can see, you can see at the bottom of the screen, you will repeat it. And then we get to 17, and then there's another shell. You notice the shell just sort of comes up when it's, again, indicating something of the action that he's taking. And it sort of marks certain blocks within the whole speech. So you had the I shall resign, and here in 17, I shall leave this office with regret. But notice again, it shifts back to will. And we also have sort of a combination of will. Before I play that, you notice you have a combination of must, can. Listen to a bit of this part. Now, I want you to notice his demeanor as well. You know what I mean? At one point, he will even smile. And what is he talking about in this part here from paragraph 17 onwards?
I shall leave this office with regret at not completing my term, but with gratitude for the privilege of serving as your president for the past 5.5 years. These years have been a momentous time in the history of our nation and the world. They have been a time of achievement in which we can all be proud. Achievements that represent the shared efforts of the administration, the Congress, and the people. But the challenges ahead are equally great, and they too will require the support and the efforts of the Congress and the people, working in cooperation with the new administration. We have ended America's longest war, but in the work of securing a lasting peace in the world, the goals ahead are even more far-reaching and more difficult. We must complete a structure of peace so that it will be said of this generation, our generation of Americans, by the people of all nations, not only that we ended one war, but that we prevented future wars. We have unlocked the doors that for a quarter of a century stood between the United States and the People's Republic of China. We must now ensure that the 1/4 of the world's people who live in the People's Republic of China will be and remain not our enemies, but our friends. In the Middle East, 100 million people in the Arab countries, many of whom have considered us their enemy for nearly 20 years, now look on us as their friends. We must continue to build on that friendship so that peace can settle at last over the Middle East, and so that the cradle of civilization will not become its grave. Together with the Soviet Union, we have made the crucial breakthroughs that have begun the process of limiting nuclear arms. But we must set as our goal not just limiting, but reducing and finally destroying these terrible weapons so that they cannot destroy civilization, and so that the threat of nuclear war will no longer hang over the world and the people. We have opened a new relation with the Soviet Union. We must continue to develop and expand that new relationship. so that the two strongest nations of the world will live together in cooperation rather than confrontation. Around the world, in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, in the Middle East, there are millions of people who live in terrible poverty, even starvation. We must keep as our goal turning away from production for war and expanding production for peace, so that people everywhere on this earth can at last look forward in their children's time, if not in our own time, to having the necessities for a decent life. Here in America, we are fortunate that most of our people have not only the blessings of liberty, but also the means to live full and good, and by the world's standards, even abundant lives. We must press on, however, toward a goal not only of more and better jobs, but of full opportunity for every American. And of what we are striving so hard right now to achieve, prosperity without inflation.
Right now, that block, 17 through 26, occurs quite frequently. People. It occurs, yes, throughout the whole text, but largely it's in this block between 17 through 26. But there's something else happening here. Here I'm looking at the pronouns that have been used. And you'll notice that first person pronoun I, me, my is used very much throughout much of the speech, except here. 17 through 26, there is no mention of first person. It is not about I, it is about we. We must. Now, that's striking within this speech, which is about his resignation. Yes, it has led up to paragraph 8, where then he resigns, and then what will be under his successor, and then here, what we have done and we must do. Before coming in paragraph 27, back to the resignation, the first person. Again, shall will appear. In that last part, when he talks about just when he gets to that, after that paragraph 17 through 26, I'm going to play as he begins to go on. And I want you to notice that there is such a gap between where he ends in 26 before going back on to the first person and talking again, no longer about the future, no longer an agenda as though he were still the president. Shall, again, as I said, will come back here, and it is again the actions that he's taking.
For more than a quarter of a...
Did you notice that? Notice that gap. Now, this was just after 26, when he's talking all about we and what we must do and all the accomplishments that he had as president.
For more than a quarter of a century in public life, I have shared in the turbulent history of this era. I have fought for what I believed in. I have tried, to the best of my ability, to discharge those duties and meet those responsibilities that were entrusted to me. Sometimes I have succeeded, and sometimes I have failed. But always, I have taken heart from what Theodore Roosevelt once said about the man in the arena whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs and comes short again and again, because there is not effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deed. who knows the great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumphs of high achievements, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly.
All right. What we've been looking at is that this speech is indeed formed with various parts. The first to resign, then about his successor, and then what about his administration, and then coming finally back to those concluding words. Again, back to first person. One thing that I've been mentioning about is theme, and the choice of theme, meaning how it begins each of the clauses. And you'll notice that it is not that much. It is, if you compare the top, which is every mention of the pronouns, I, me, my, or we, us, and our, and so on, compare that with the bottom, which is where it occurs at the beginning as the subject. Or is something else there at the beginning. And in fact, what we notice is that there is a lot that is related to the circumstances. In other words, much of what he's explaining here, what is at the forefront, what is at the prominent in terms of as the speech progresses, it is the circumstances. He is framing this resignation within the circumstances that forced him to resign. We see that in terms of the choice compared with his second inaugural. In the resignation speech, we notice that a lot of the, what is theme, the beginnings of each clause, what is the motif, so to speak, as Halliday refers to it, we notice that 52% about is, in fact, the circumstance. Before I play this, I'm going to play immediately after the speech. You had the press responding to this. It had just been televised, and this was the response. The response that was given. This is CBS News, and the newscaster, well known at the time, Walter Cronkite, and another guy who would give commentary, Eric Severide. This was their immediate response. And now it's interesting to observe their immediate response to Nixon's resignation. They've not prepared. They did not know what was coming. It had not been released prior. And so this is their immediate response.
And so Richard Milhouse Nixon has resigned as the 37th President of the United States, effective at when Gerald Ford, the Vice President, will be sworn in as the 38th President of the United States. It was a 16-minute speech in which the President seemed calm but controlling, obviously, very deep emotions. He did not, I think my colleagues will agree, confess any crimes in regard to the Watergate or any other matters. He said that he was guilty perhaps of some bad judgment, but that was all. Eric?
Yes, there'd been no further admissions. Perhaps it was foolish for people on the Hill and some of us to think that there might have been. He has said, in effect, he is not resigning because of a sense of guilt, of any criminality, but because his political base has eroded in the Congress, and he could not be effective even if he went on through the long periods of impeachment and trial in the Senate, and therefore it's best to cut this thing short in the interest of the whole country. On the whole, it seemed to me as effective, as magnanimous a speech as Mr. Nixon has ever made, and I suppose there'll be many even among his critics who will say that perhaps that few things in his presidency became him as much as his manner of leaving the presidency. certainly no attacks on his enemies, none on the press, as we did have from Vice President Agnew a year ago when he resigned. I think people would find it very hard to fault this. A man is certainly entitled to call attention with his last words as president to what he considers his positive acts, which are those of trying to make peace in this world. Obviously, that is how he wishes to be remembered. And perhaps that will be the positive side of his record, even for many years to come, I think.
It certainly was a conciliatory speech. He even paid tribute to those who have been in opposition to him, which hasn't always been the case with President Nixon's speeches, and said he was sure that their interests in the country were the same as his, but they approached the problem from different viewpoints. Dan Rather, our White House correspondent, Roger Mudd, our Capitol Hill correspondent, are with us also, along with Eric, in the studio here in Washington. Gentlemen, your reactions for tonight's speech.
Walter, I think it may very well go down when history takes a look at it as one of Richard Nixon's, if not his finest hour. Needs to be made clear and can't be reemphasized too often, I think, as I think the president made clear in his speech. There is no joy in this for anyone tonight. No decent thinking American could take any joy out of this. That sadness is tempered by, for many, with awe for the constitutional process, what we sometimes call the system, which worked magnificently. It was that constitutional process. It was a process of law which brought us to this moment. The President made, in his speech, made clear that he respects that, he understands that, he has that appreciation and that awe for it. He did give, and I would agree with Walter, what you said, he gave to this moment a touch of class, more than that, a touch of majesty, touching that nerve in most people that says to their brain, we revere the presidency, we respect the president, the republic and the country comes first.
Isn't it striking? His finest hour, a touch of class, a touch of majesty. The response here is overwhelmingly positive. And yet it is at a time when this president is resigning in disgrace. What should be his lowest moment becomes his greatest hour. The nature of the speech itself. Yes, he had asked for a speech that would be healing. And to a certain extent, it seemed to have been achieved. Because this was the response where you would have expected people to be faulting him, to be angry. There is none of that. And so in many ways, this was a very effective speech, even though it was simply to resign as president. We'll take a break here. It's 2:02. We'll take a break. Interesting, you know, as you can see here, Richard Nixon was the 37th president. And do you remember what he said at the beginning of that resignation speech? It was the 37th time that he was speaking to the nation from the Oval Office in the White House. That's quite striking. In any case, let's indeed take a break. And when we come back, yes, I'm going to look at the second inaugural. Now, this is, as you remember, the Watergate scandal had begun during the re-election process. It was ongoing when the election took place. Nixon still won with a landslide over his opponent, and he went on to give his second inaugural, which would be later, not long after, he will be resigning and he would be departing. We're going to take a look at some of the features of that second inaugural. And we will have an idea, perhaps, why some consider, even though they politically maybe very opposed to Nixon, still considered him to be an outstanding speaker. All right, let's take a break. Parataxis versus hypotaxis, that it fits the same pattern as his resignation speech. It fits, again, what we saw with Obama's Yes We Can speech and Trump's, even his speech to Congress. Clearly, there is this sort of similarity that we can see in terms of the nexus relations that exist. Okay, so let's take a look more at this second inaugural. I'm going to be taking a look at a part of it, and I'm going to be illustrating a point from it as well. And that is that there are the hallmarks here of what we would see in a speech that has been written to be read aloud, to facilitate our being able to process it as we hear it. And part of that is something we've called thematic progression. And I mentioned this before, where you have some idea that sort of you conclude with, it's new information. I've highlighted it here, peace in the world. And then in the next paragraph, the next sentence, it's about the peace we seek in the world. In other words, you have this sort of carry on connection from what was introduced as a new idea toward the end of a block of text. It could be a clause, it could be the paragraph itself. And what follows in here, the next paragraph, the peace we seek in the world. That linear thematic progression, the new information becomes the old information and repeated in the very next clause, the next sentence. So what he goes on then into paragraphs 4, and I'm just looking at paragraphs 3 through 11 of the second inaugural, and you'll see why in a minute. But I'm going to highlight the fact here, and you can hear him just this part of the speech. So paragraph 3, this is sort of the beginning of a section that we'll identify later how it's sort of unique. Paragraphs 3 through 11. Paragraph 3 is sort of the nucleus, which then will be carried on and elaborated further, beginning in paragraph 4, up through paragraph 11.
This past year saw far-reaching results from our new policies for peace. By continuing to revitalize our traditional friendships and by our missions to Peking and to Moscow, we were able to establish the base for a new and more durable pattern of relationships among the nations of the world. Because of America's bold initiatives, 1972 will be long remembered as the year of the greatest progress since the end of World War II toward a lasting peace in the world. The peace we seek in the world is not the flimsy peace which is merely an interlude between wars, but a peace which can endure for generations to come.
Okay, so he now is going to talk about what the nature of this peace is. In paragraph 4, he's going to be saying something about America's role in maintaining that peace, but then he's going to, in paragraph 5, you notice, but. And what does the but indicate? It's sort of a kind of concession. Okay, this has been America's role, but. Then he's going to sort of redefine what that role is. So very clearly, the markers are there to help us sort of be able to follow the speech. The linear thematic progression, the use of conjunction.
It is important that we understand both the necessity
and the limitations of America's role in maintaining that peace. Unless we in America work to preserve the peace, there will be no peace. Unless we in America work to preserve freedom, there will be no freedom. But let us clearly understand the new nature of America's role as a result of the new policies we have adopted over these past 4 years.
All right, so he's saying America has a role in preserving freedom, preserving peace, but let us clearly understand the new nature of America's role. So yes, he's saying this is all well and good, but, and then he's going to be redefining what that role is in paragraphs 5 through 11. Now, paragraph 5 began with but. What is he go on to say then? 6, 7, 8, and 9 all begin the same way. We shall, we shall, we shall, we shall. This sort of continuous repetition marks sort of a symmetry, a kind of parataxis. See, there are obviously 4 points. What are these 4 points in terms of the policies that will be adopted? We shall do this, we shall do that, and on. Again, it's a kind of continuous thematic progression, a kind of repeating at the beginning the same thing. That repetition adds a kind of symmetry, adds a kind of parataxis to the overall structure of the text. What we see being built here is the architecture of the speech. This is a speech that has been clearly written to be read aloud, to be spoken, with all the markers there that indicate the logical progression of ideas.
But let us clearly understand the new nature of America's role as a result of the new policies we have adopted over these past 4 years. We shall respect our treaty commitments. We shall support vigorously the principle that no country has the right to impose its will or rule on another by force. We shall continue in this era of negotiation to work for the limitation of nuclear arms and to reduce the danger of confrontation between the great powers. We shall do our share in defending peace and freedom in the world, but we shall expect others to do their share.
All right, so we can see, and let's sort of highlight the points that we've made so far, and we can see how this text then forms a kind of structure where you introduce the basic idea in paragraph 3, which then is elaborated in 4 through 11. The connection between 4 and 5 is expressed through but. You're saying one thing, but then signaling the fact that it is somehow being redefined. And how that is redefined is laid out in the 4 steps, 6, 7, 8, 9 through 11. So the structures, the architectures becomes very apparent to us as we listen to it. And all of these devices help us to be able to follow it coherently. What I've shown you here has been sort of on the right-hand side, you can see the way we've sort of drawn it. I mean, we've sort of see it develop, but I want to turn this sort of upside down. Begin sort of work our way from the top and consider how it has, see this text as a kind of building. I've used the metaphor architecture. How is it built? And I've turned it upside down in a way to just sort of see how it has been developing, how it has been building up through to finally 10 and 11, paragraphs 10 and 11. Now, why did I choose this part here? Now, you'll notice that here I show the architecture for the whole speech. You'll notice that paragraphs 3 through 11 seem to build up to an idea, and then it seems to go on to something else. The architecture, the fact that these paragraphs from 3 through 11 belong together, that they build up to a certain idea, is supported by the texture of this span of text. I want you to notice throughout the text, and I put it on the side here, let us, let us. Notice let us is repeated so many times throughout this speech. Well, that is to be expected. It is the inaugural of his second term as president. He's setting the agenda for what will be his presidency, what he expects will be his presidency for the next 4 years. But notice that there is a block here, 3 through 11, where let us occurs only once. Very distinctive, very unique compared to the rest of the text. You might say that paragraphs 3 through 11 have a different texture. They have a different pattern. They are not let us. What was paragraphs 3 through 11? Why does it have a different texture? We can only really surmise here, because no one has really said. But you have to see this speech in another context, also historical. 2 weeks later, I believe it was correct, 2 weeks later, after this speech, the U.S. will announce peace with Vietnam. So, paragraphs 3 through 11, do you remember what it was about? Peace in the world. Perhaps this was added later when it became apparent that soon they would be announcing peace with Vietnam, and this part was later added, so it had a different texture about it. You see, a text has a texture, and it has an architecture. When a speech is written, drafted, to be read aloud, it has certain features that make that architecture more apparent. And the architecture is what gives us a sense of the coherence of the text. We understand it. We see the structure of it. But there's another element here, and that is the patterning, the texture. And you can see that in the repetition here. Let us, let us, let us, repeated throughout, except here in this block. You see, language is very interesting. But the other aspect that I wanted to sort of emphasize today, and that is that language occurs in a context. Not just the situation. I mean, the situation, the immediate situation, it occurs within a historical context as well. And you can see that in these speeches that we've looked at today in terms of his departure, his resignation, his second inaugural. Look at it within the context of the history that was unfolding and what was happening at the same time, and the politics that was going on related to the scandal, but at the same time, what was happening in terms of world affairs. And what we see within we see that language comes alongside and plays a very significant role in how a speech becomes effective. And so what, in fact, yes, was indeed remarkable was that not long after this, he will give a resignation speech, and that resignation speech can be called his finest hour, is truly remarkable. We're going to, in the time remaining, I won't be able to cover all that I wanted to, and we'll carry it over into next week. We're going to begin the topic of commencement speeches. And you remember, I've mentioned this before, and we've looked at some examples. You remember Susan Rice, her commencement speech? And we noticed in her speech about that we have to be we have to make the change. What is a commencement speech? I think you remember, right? Is at a graduation. And this is very frequently the case in American universities, where they get someone who's well known and need not be an academic. It could be a celebrity. It could be a politician. And they come to give a speech, and because of their celebrity status, it usually is marked by sort of a rather first-person kind of account of their life and how they sort of reach to this point at which they are now considered a success. And therefore, they're giving advice on to graduating seniors from perhaps a university. Even high schools, secondary schools would have this commencement speech at the graduation, meant to give advice, all right? It's meant to motivate. It's a motivational speech. Motivate the students to go on to pursue success and perhaps along the lines of whoever this major celebrity or politician or otherwise is speaking to them. Now, top 10 commencement speeches. Remember Time magazine identified, and I've looked at with you before David Foster Wallace. I'm going to review that a little bit today with you, because it's going to be helpful to contrast that with Steve Jobs. We're going to be looking at Steve Jobs' commencement speech, and I'm going to be reviewing a bit, first of all, though, to remind you, David Foster Wallace, because the contrast could not be greater. What's fascinating is that the two would be considered to be at the top of this top 10 commencement speeches. Remember David Foster Wallace? He was this postmodern writer, and very successful in terms of his novel, and on Time magazine, Newsweek magazine's cover here, as you can see. And he was invited to give an address at what is really a small college. I think you are aware that in the U.S. and the States, when we talk about a college, it's a tertiary level. It's not secondary school level, such as it is here in some cases in Hong Kong. They gave this commencement speech at Kenyon College. Now, I want to remind you what Time magazine said about his commencement speech. This address at Kenyon was vintage Wallace. Smart, occasionally meandering discussion of the issues that consumed him, from the banality of life to the meaning of consciousness. I know that this stuff probably doesn't sound fun and breezy and grandly inspirational, he concluded. What it is, so far as I can see, is the truth. The capital T truth is about life before death. It is about making it to 30 or maybe 50 without wanting to shoot yourself in the head. Time magazine continues, all the reasons Wallace didn't make it to 50. And we talked about this before. He did commit suicide. Suicide that was largely due to his depression. And I think I mentioned to you previously the fact that he had been under medication for depression since his time in university. That he afterwards had written this very popular novel, and thereafter tried to produce another novel that would be as great as the other. But as he had great difficulty writing. It just wasn't coming to him, and he began to think that it was the medication that he was receiving that was preventing him from being able to be creative. So he went off his medication and ended up committing suicide. But suicide figures so much in the novel that he wrote, and it also even here, all right? So as the Time magazine writer says, all the reasons Wallace didn't make it to 50 are apparent here. In hindsight, the speech reads like the first draft of a suicide note for an author who took his own life last year at age 46. It's a macabre read. There's tons that's worthwhile here. The speech crackles with wit and intelligence and offers tricks for escaping the depression to which Wallace ultimately succumbed.
Greetings, thanks, and congratulations to Kenyon's graduating class of 2005. There are these two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What the hell is water?" This is a standard requirement of U.S. commencement speeches, the deployment of didactic little parable-ish stories. The story thing turns out to be one of the better, less bullshitty conventions of the genre. But if you're worried that I plan to present myself here as the wise older fish explaining what water is to you younger fish, please don't be. I am not the wise old fish.
He's not the wise old fish. And if you remember, one of the points that I made when I introduced this commencement speech to you before was the fact that as he's speaking, because he's noted for having very complex clauses, and it's true here as well, but he has interspersed throughout these very short, very brief, simple statements, like "this is not a matter of virtue," or "this question gets very tricky," which always seems to sort of draw our attention by its brevity, by the fact that it is so brief and so simple, to what follows. We notice that we have these sort of valleys before he gets to what it is that he's wanting to say.
Please don't worry that I'm getting ready to lecture you about compassion or other directedness or all the so-called virtues. This is not a matter of virtue. It's a matter of my choosing to do the work of somehow altering or getting free of my natural, hardwired default setting, which is to be deeply and literally self-centered, and to see and interpret everything through this lens of self. People who can adjust their natural default setting this way are often described as being well-adjusted, which I suggest to you is not an accidental term. Given the triumphant academic setting here, an obvious question is how much of this work of adjusting our default setting involves actual knowledge or intellect. This question gets very tricky. Probably the most dangerous thing about an academic education, at least in my own case, is that it enables my tendency to over-intellectualize stuff, to get lost in abstract arguments inside my head instead of simply paying attention to what's going on right in front of me, paying attention to what is going on inside me.
So the point that I came to conclude with you about this speech was that it is an anti-text. It isn't your typical commencement speech. But yet it's ranked at the top of commencement speeches. That's quite a paradox. It is an anti-commencement speech, we could say. He talks about the fact that sort of a standard requirement of U.S. commencement speeches that there should be a little story with a moral about it, didactic little parable-ish story. Then he goes on to say, "I'm not the wise old fish. I'm not here to give you advice." He then goes on to say, "I know that this stuff probably doesn't sound fun and breezy or grandly inspirational the way a commencement speech is supposed to sound." He knows it isn't like what a commencement speech is supposed to be like.
I know that this stuff probably doesn't sound fun and breezy or grandly inspirational the way a commencement speech is supposed to sound. What it is, as far as I can see, is the capital T truth with a whole lot of rhetorical niceties stripped away. You are, of course, free to think of it whatever you wish. But please don't just dismiss it as some finger-wagging Dr. Laura sermon. None of this stuff is really about morality or religion or dogma or big fancy questions of life after death. The capital T truth is about life before death. It is about the real value of a real education, which has almost nothing to do with knowledge and everything to do with simple awareness. Awareness of what is so real and essential, so hidden in plain sight all around us all the time, that we have to keep reminding ourselves over and over, this is water. This is water. It is unimaginably hard to do this, to stay conscious and alive in the adult world day in and day out. Which means yet another grand cliche turns out to be true. Your education really is the job of a lifetime, and it commences now. I wish you way more than luck.
So his whole speech basically is an anti-text that is intended to sort of break us out of our default setting, basically introducing a counter reality to the reality that we are so familiar with, which is our own self-centeredness. And so he does it with a text that is against the mold. Really the idea of de-automatization, as is so apparent, and it is intended, the whole speech, the whole text itself is against the automatic of what a commencement speech is supposed to be like, in order to make a point about us needing to be aware of and being able to realize a reality that is against our automatic default setting, which is to be self-centered. All right, so that's David Foster Wallace. Now, Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs' commencement speech is, I mean, it's a famous speech. How does it compare with what we've been looking at with David Foster Wallace? Now, there's a few sort of rhetorical devices that we see in his commencement speech, which are typical of these speeches that are written to be read aloud. I mean, these people are not speaking spontaneously or extemporaneously. They are reading a text. And when you see Steve Jobs make the presentation, we won't probably watch it today. The time is going to be up soon, and we'll come back to this. But when you see him, you'll see that he is reading it. But it's striking that the way he reads it is almost like he's just speaking to us normally in a conversation. And this is amazing. When you can take something which is thought out, that is developed there, well, that really does involve design. It does involve craft. And there is a design here. We see the rule of three, for example. You'll see, I learned about serif and sans serif typefaces, about varying the amount of space between different letter combinations, about what makes great typography great, about. It was beautiful, historical, artistically subtle, because almost everything, all external expectations, all pride, all fear of embarrassment or failure, it means, don't waste, don't be trapped, don't let. He repeats one phrase throughout the text, stay hungry, stay foolish. He repeats it 3 times. The rule of three. Well, we've seen it in Obama's speeches as well. There's another, which is sort of the antithesis, or some would say antithesis, which is you're juxtaposing contrasting words that are parallel, dropped out, dropping in. He repeats it, dropped out, drop in. Look forward, look backwards. The heaviness, the lightness, death and life, old and new. We saw some of this, and you remember Edwin Tumbu's Gods Can Die. Well, we see the same kind of contrasts here that are being repeated. So there is decidedly a design to this speech. And here's as I told you, I like to do a word cloud of a text. And the word cloud gives me an overview of what is going to come up. And what do you see here? Life, college, Apple. In fact, his speech breaks down into 3 stories. Very clearly, he says, I'm going to tell you 3 stories. Stories of his life. Now, this is more typical of what you see in a commencement speech. It is the story of the person's life. It is their narrative, so to speak. It is sort of the wise old fish giving advice to the young fish, all right? And so, what do you think the 3 stories are about? Well, the first story is college. The second story is Apple, him getting fired from Apple. What's the last story about? Death. When it was discovered that he had cancer the first time. These are the 3 stories. We're going to take a look, and we'll do this next week because we're almost to the end, and I don't want to start this and then come back, stop it midway. So, or very partially done. Let's hold off until next time, and when we do, we'll come back. We'll take a look at the first story. I think maybe we have time just to listen to the first story. You'll get some feel for it.
Today, I want to tell you 3 stories from my life. That's it. No big deal. Just 3 stories. The first story is about connecting the dots. I dropped out of Reed College after the first 6 months, but then stayed around as a drop-in for another 18 months or so before I really quit. So why'd I drop out? It started before I was born. My biological mother was a young, unwed graduate student, and she decided to put me up for adoption. She felt very strongly that I should be adopted by college graduates, so everything was all set for me to be adopted at birth by a lawyer and his wife. Except that when I popped out, they decided at the last minute that they really wanted a girl. So my parents, who were on a waiting list, got a call in the middle of the night asking, "We've got an unexpected baby boy. Do you want him?" They said, "Of course." My biological mother found out later that my mother had never graduated from college and that my father had never graduated from high school. She refused to sign the final adoption papers. She only relented a few months later when my parents promised that I would go to college. This was the start in my life. And 17 years later, I did go to college. But I naively chose a college that was almost as expensive as Stanford. And all of my working class parents' savings were being spent on my college tuition. After 6 months, I couldn't see the value in it. I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life, and no idea how college was going to help me figure it out. And here I was, spending all of the money my parents had saved their entire life. So I decided to drop out and trust that it would all work out okay. It was pretty scary at the time, but looking back, it was one of the best decisions I ever made. The minute I dropped out, I could stop taking the required classes that didn't interest me and begin dropping in on the ones that looked far more interesting. It wasn't all romantic. I didn't have a dorm room, so I slept on the floor in friends' rooms. I returned Coke bottles for the 5-cent deposits to buy food with. And I would walk the 7 miles across town every Sunday night to get one good meal a week at the Hare Krishna temple. I loved it. And much of what I stumbled into by following my curiosity and intuition turned out to be priceless later on. Let me give you one example. Reed College at that time offered perhaps the best calligraphy instruction in the country. Throughout the campus, every poster, every label on every drawer was beautifully hand calligraphed. Because I had dropped out and didn't have to take the normal classes, I decided to take a calligraphy class to learn how to do this. I learned about serif and sans serif typefaces, about varying the amount of space between different letter combinations, about what makes great typography great. It was beautiful, historical, artistically subtle in a way that science can't capture, and I found it fascinating. None of this had even a hope of any practical application in my life. But 10 years later, when we were designing the first Macintosh computer, it all came back to me. And we designed it all into the Mac. It was the first computer with beautiful typography. If I had never dropped in on that single course in college, the Mac would have never had multiple typefaces or proportionally spaced fonts. And since Windows just copied the Mac, it's likely that no personal computer would have them. If I had never dropped out, I would have never dropped in on that calligraphy class, and personal computers might not have the wonderful typography that they do. Of course, it was impossible to connect the dots looking forward when I was in college, but it was very, very clear looking backwards 10 years later. Again, you can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backwards. So you have to trust that the dots will somehow connect in your future. You have to trust in something, your gut, destiny, life, karma, whatever. Because believing that the dots will connect down the road will give you the confidence to follow your heart, even when it leads you off the well-worn path. And that will make all the difference.
Okay, we'll stop there. And when we come back next week, we'll be looking at the three stories. Steve Jobs' commencement speech. It's not the anti-commencement speech that is David Foster Wallace's, but it does have a clear message as well, which we'll take a look at. And I think it is an effective speech. I can see why it would be near the top of Time's top 10 commencement speeches. So see you next week. Have a good week. Bye-bye.